Hello, anatomy class. So after watching some of these, I guess it appears that these are a little bit on the boring side. I'm not trying to make it boring. I'm trying to help you guys out and hopefully be able to do the notes from remote places and all those things. I know everyone's in a different spot. It just appears that people are not watching these videos. I'm not sure what else I could do. Maybe stand on my head or jump on the desk and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, today we're going to be looking at the chapter that we were in before we got out of school. So this was what we were doing right before spring break. And my hope is to refresh you a little bit. We really were almost done. And we talked about how we could kind of force things and get done and just kind of push it a little bit before spring break. Or we could take a little bit of extra time. And then we didn't know this was going to happen. So I might like to do a lab or two with this. Many of you guys are doing great work. So let's go ahead and start with today, and we'll review just for a couple minutes. These always end up a little longer than what I'd like. I'll try to keep it under 10 minutes. I know many of you are busy and working. Others of you are kind of staying at home. So let's see what we've got here. Okay. So if you remember, the cardiovascular system had to do with all of our vessels, so our veins and arteries and capillaries. And the main thing was that they were going to supply oxygen and all the nutrients to our tissues. Okay, so pretty much every part of the body that needs blood in some way is going to need the cardiovascular system. Okay, so we're keeping the oxygen-rich blood separate, directing it in one direction. This is what separates us from a lot of the primitive species, is that we have the separation from the oxygen-rich and the oxygen-poor blood. Okay, so it's going to be going in one direction. The veins and all of the different arteries are all separate, and that's the part that's important. Okay, remember we talked about it being the size of a fist. The pericardium is the hard connective tissue surrounding that goes around it to protect it. And then we had the three layers, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Okay, 4 chambers. And also we said the main purpose of the atria, okay, so there's one here and one over here, was to pump up the ventricles. And what it does is it really allows them to expand and hold more blood and hold more force. So when these guys do their pumping, it's really going to pump out with a lot more force. Okay, this was a chart that we've done now, I believe, a couple of times. And so what we have is the right atrium pumps into here, then the blood flow goes out through the pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay, so we got the pulmonary arteries. This is the only time that I'm aware of where an artery has oxygen-poor blood. Okay, it goes to the lungs on both sides, comes back full of oxygen to the pulmonary veins, the left atrium, which pumps through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle then pumps out through this, which is the aortic semilunar valve, goes out through the aorta and goes to all these other places. Okay, we said it was like a double pump, just explain that. So the main thing that we talked about here was pulmonary versus systemic. Pulmonary was when we went to the lungs and back. That was controlled by the right side of the heart. And systemic is when it goes from the left side all the way throughout the body. So that left ventricle is the last contact point as far as the different chambers for the blood, and it's going to send it out throughout the whole body. So if you remember, when we dissected the heart, the walls of the left side were much thicker. They had to be a lot stronger. Okay, and this shows you kind of the other different type of diagram as far as the blood flow. So this represents all the lower body tissues. This represents upper body tissues, the brain, and these are the lungs. And so this little separation here are the capillaries, where it gets to those little small vessels. Okay, so we have the valves. There's bicuspid valve and the tricuspid. Okay, the bicuspid is on the left side, tricuspid is on the right side. And then we also had 2 pulmonary valves, the pulmonary semilunar and also the aortic semilunar. 2 semilunar valves, not 2 pulmonary valves. Okay, so cardiac, we also mentioned a little bit when people have heart transplants or heart surgeries. Okay, so where they have a bypass, what they're actually doing is bypassing blockages in these coronary arteries. So even though the heart is bathed in blood on the inside all the time, it has to have blood supplying its tissues. So as the blood goes through these coronary arteries, and it's going to supply the tissues, and then it goes back through the coronary veins. Okay, so the sinoatrial node, this works with the autonomic nervous system. And so kind of a little bit like what we talked about is that it senses a need. And so when you are running up a hill, when you are sprinting after getting the ball in a football game, or you're diving towards the ball in a volleyball match, or you're flying through the air when you're cheerleading, okay, all of those things are going to require much more blood, and the body senses the need, and it stimulates that autonomic nervous system, the automatic response, and works with the sinoatrial node like a pacemaker to regulate those heartbeats. They happen at the same time, systole and diastole. Also, I've heard it referred to as systole and diastole. Okay, so you pronounce it how you like. Refers to the ventricles. Okay, so we're concerned with that, not the atrium. And this is what gives us that lubbed up sound. It's the valves actually opening and closing, and you can hear that. Okay, just basic. This is really going to depend on all kinds of different things. The fetus is going to have very high heart rate, and as children get older, their heart rates settle a little bit more. Males typically have a little bit lower, females have a little bit higher. That's just a guideline. I mean, there are females that have probably in the 40s and males that have resting heart rates over 100. And so it's not just set in stone. It has to do with your overall physiology, your health, any type of underlying heart conditions or anything that you might have as well. Cardiac output is kind of a interesting aspect of all this as well, is that as your heart gets stronger, your heart rate can get lower because this is a basic formula. So the cardiac output is how much blood is being pumped through the heart at any given time. And so that is a formula of your heart rate times your stroke volume. The stroke volume is the amount of blood that is being pumped each pump. Okay, so if you remember the demonstration that we did in class before all of this was that I showed you a kind of a different cup that had a certain amount was 70 milliliters, which was the average stroke volume, and then all the way up from there when someone gets a much stronger heart. Okay, so this is why a lot of times people who are endurance athletes or very highly conditioned will have very low resting heart rates because their heart is pumping out more per each beat. Okay, and these are a couple of examples. Okay, this is, I believe, right about close to where we left off. Arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries are away from the heart, so I always think of arteries away. Walls are much thicker because they have to deal with the pressure. This pressure wave, the arterial pulse, so when you put your finger on your wrist or on the side of your neck, you're feeling your carotid artery here. What you're doing is you're feeling that rush of blood every single heartbeat. Okay, so that's what the pulse means. Veins are going back to the heart, and the pressure is very low. After it has to go through all of these capillaries here, by the time it starts getting back towards the heart, the pressure is very low. So we have these valves to keep it only going one direction. And our muscle activity will squish through that, which we have a picture here. Okay, if you remember this, the muscles will squish it, and then it only is allowed to go one direction. When people have varicose veins, a lot of times that's when these valves are damaged and the blood is allowed to pool. Capillaries are in between. They're only sometimes even just wider than one blood cell, and that allows all this nutrients and all of these gases like oxygen to be able to get to the particular tissues that they need. Okay, so what we're talking about with this is the large systemic arteries. Okay, so these are the ones like the big ones, the carotid artery, the radial artery, some of the other ones we'll talk about here in just a minute. Okay, so as it leaves the heart, it's its highest pressure. So it's kind of one of those things, if you connected a whole bunch of hoses to your garden hose and you split it 20 different times, it's going to be the highest pressure right by the faucet. And as it gets distributed, the pressure is going to be reduced. And a couple different examples are hypotension and hypertension. So hypo is when it's too low, Hyper is when it's too high. Also, a lot of times people will have reduced amount of salts, because what happens is that actually will draw a lot of those extra fluids into the bloodstream. Okay, so if you remember that from a hypertonic environment from biology, and then that creates more pressure because there's too much fluid in there. All right, so this was a lab that we were going to do. So very simply, let me describe it. Maybe I can film one of us doing this with the family and see if you guys can get it. Some of you that were in the nursing classes already know how to do this, but let me make sense to you with this. Okay, so you put the cuff on. Probably all of us have been to the doctor and had this done before, and they pump it up. What happens is this cuff gets enough pressure that it is now completely closing that artery. Okay, so this is the artery that's on your arm that completely closes it to where even when the heart beats, it can't overcome that pressure. Okay, so that's why they pump it up really high. And then they're listening as they slowly lower the pressure. And when they start to hear thump, thump, what's actually happening is as your heart beats, it opens up that artery just enough to overcome the cuff pressure while it's beating. And then when it's resting, the pressure is high. Okay, so those are the differences between the two numbers. So that's the systolic pressure, is when they start to hear that artery opening. The diastolic is when that is now open all the time. So they're not hearing any more thumps. You'll listen for the second round, and when you don't hear any more thumps, now that artery is open all the time because there's enough pressure in the artery to overcome the pressure in the cuff. Okay, so the final thing is on the major arteries. So we go out from the aorta, and then it branches out into all of these other ones. The brachiocephalic, we go to the carotid arteries. There's internal and external carotids, temporal. If you've ever sat like this and you can feel your pulse, okay, so that's your temporal artery or temporal artery. So that's like near your temple, okay? So that's one reason why it's called that. And you have all of these other ones that go down through here, the femoral, okay, near your femur. You have a deep femoral, popliteal, which remember is the anterior surface of the knee. We're not going to get into all of these. The ones that I wanted you guys to be able to be aware of, okay, out of this whole chart, were the subclavian, carotid, coronary, thoracic, iliac, and abdominal. Okay, so these are all different parts that branch off that aorta. The major veins, these are the ones that are going back. You've probably heard of jugular veins. Sometimes it's an expression when they say go for the kill. Maybe even in sports, they say go for the jugular. That just means like a lot of animals, when they attack, will try to attack at the neck, and then that drains the head very quickly and their prey will die. So that's the jugular vein. The brachiocephalic, brachial means arm, cephalic means head. So these are going to drain the arms, and they merge in with the jugular right here to go back with the heart. The last thing is the capillary exchange. So this is something that you probably understand already, but just to explain it, this is where gas exchange takes place. So in the tissues, what you have is our bloodstream has higher levels of oxygen than carbon dioxide. So the oxygen is going into the tissues, carbon dioxide is going out. And what you could see with that is it's just going from higher concentration to lower concentration. That same blood goes into the lungs, and now there's a higher concentration of oxygen in the lungs than the used up blood, so it goes into the blood and refreshes it. Higher concentration of carbon dioxide in those blood vessels, they go out into the lungs and you breathe out. So that was very, very quick for an entire chapter. Watch it again if you want. This is really just to help you, to make sure that you have all the notes, to make sure that you're understanding. Hit me up if you guys have any questions, and I hope that you are doing well.